Welcome to the Ministry of Gray, where we break free from black and white thinking and uncover the truth somewhere in the middle. Happy weekend, everybody. This is your host, Satan's Little Side Piece, and we are on episode 8 of the Ministry of Gray podcast, where we're going to unpack the tangled mess of religion, politics, and hypocrisy with a healthy dose of critical thinking. We're going to switch things up a bit, though, this episode. I want to cover multiple topics instead of diving deep into just one. And today, we're going to look at how politicians manipulate logic to pass religiously restrictive laws, exposing the latest hypocrisy from religious leaders, taking a hard look at Pope Francis's legacy, and starting a new recurring segment on deconstruction. So, settle in with your favorite glass of something something or a bowl of communion wafers and dip, because we got a lot to unpack this episode. You ever listen to a politician argue for a religiously motivated law and think to yourself, that sounds so wrong, but I can't quite put my finger on why? And that's because a lot of political arguments aren't actually arguments at all. They're logical fallacies. And if you don't know quite what to look for or listen for, it's very easy to get swept up in their bad reasoning. And today, I'm going to break down the top 10 fallacies politicians use to justify a lot of these religious laws that we're seeing lately, like the personhood laws, the restrictions that they're putting on getting a no fault divorce now in states like Oklahoma. And I'm going to explain to you why these fallacies, though, are so damn effective and also why they're complete garbage. So let's get started with a classic. I think a lot of us are very familiar with this one, and it's called the slippery slope fallacy. I think the best way I can describe it would be the argument of if we allow this, everything will fall apart mentality. Typically, when this is used, like as an example, they'll say something like, if we legalize same-sex marriage, churches will be forced to perform them and religious freedom will be destroyed. We hear this constantly from the Republicans, right? And you're probably thinking to yourself, why does this fallacy work so well? And that's because fear is one hell of a motivator. If people believe that one small change will lead to extreme consequences, they panic. But I think it's essential to be clear, no church has ever been forced to perform a same-sex marriage against its will. This argument is literally just an imaginary disaster scenario designed to scare people and drum up support. Another common fallacy that's used that you may not have directly heard of is the appeal to tradition fallacy. Now, you may not have heard this term, but I promise you, when I give you the example, you're going to immediately recognize it. This fallacy, it argues that something should continue just because it's been done this way before. You know the old saying, if it ain't broken, you don't need to fix it. Or your grandma might say, well, we've always done it this way and we're going to continue doing it this way. That mentality, okay? You'll hear politicians say things like, the 10 Commandments have always been part of American heritage, so they should be displayed in classrooms. And this is an effective argument because a lot of times, and it doesn't matter if you're religious or secular, I think it's just within human nature that we tend to confuse longevity with validity. It feels kind of comforting to think that something that's existed for a long time has to be of value. But if we're being real with ourselves here, if we applied this logic consistently, we'd still have segregated schools, child labor, and I think women would still be banned from voting because those things were traditional once upon a time as well. Just because something's been around for a long time, as you know, doesn't mean it should stay. Nancy Pelosi. Yeah. Let's talk about the third fallacy that's also used. And I see this one a lot, and this is kind of complicated if you're not familiar with it. It's called the false equivalence fallacy. And what it does is it makes two completely different things sound exactly the same, equivocating them in a way, even when they are not at all remotely the same. If someone were to say, if we don't allow teachers to lead prayer in schools, we're persecuting Christians. See, this is framing the majority as the victim in this case. And if people believe that not getting special treatment is the same as being oppressed, they'll fight to maintain their privileged status, which is what we're seeing today. In reality, banning state led prayer in schools doesn't stop anyone from praying. It just says, hey, the government is not going to enforce prayer, or I should say, force prayer, impose prayer upon, students. That's called neutrality, not persecution. But again, with a false equivocation like this, it's very easy for Republicans and MAGA and Christians to kind of feel that this is, in fact, a legitimate argument. Another common issue that we run into when we're dealing with politicians and all of these ridiculous proposals that they put out there that clearly favor the Christian majority, a favorite is an appeal to emotion fallacy. And that's because relying on emotions instead of facts is a lot easier when you're trying to push an agenda. Someone might say something like, imagine how a baby feels during an abortion. And because humans are emotional creatures, if you make them feel something strongly, they're less likely to think critically, even though laws should be based on facts, not feelings, of course. And the fact is, abortion bans actually hurt real people, including victims of rape, incest, and life threatening pregnancies. But they're playing on emotions, kind of like with that Sarah McLachlan song In the Arms of the Angels. And it's like 3 in the morning and you're watching late night TV and that commercial comes on about abused animals around the world and wanting your money. This is just playing on all of your emotions. And study after study has shown that emotional appeal is more effective in, convincing someone of your argument than presenting them with the cold hard facts of the matter. And that's because your emotions, they elicit a physiological response. It could be dopamine, it could be different pheromone responses if it's something romantic, flight or fight, all of that. All of those feelings and responses are triggered by emotion, which gives you a very compelling response to someone's argumentation. That's why you'll see them use appeal to emotion all the time. You saw this with Laken Riley, and they're bringing her up after she was brutally murdered by an illegal immigrant. This person came in and committed an atrocity against her. And by bringing up her story, it elicits outrage and a sense of urgency to correct this problem and prevent more tragedy like this from happening. We're imagining the terror she must have felt. All of these things come into play when they're using her memory to push this massive deportation program that is somewhat inhumane and deprives individuals of basic human rights. Another popular fallacy is the ad populum, the appeal to the majority. This fallacy, it argues that if a majority believes something, it must be right. Kind of like, back in the 1500s when they still thought the world was flat. They thought that bathing would open you up to more disease. Like, this was the popular majority belief at the time. It was the common knowledge, the shared knowledge at the time in the world. And because of it was the majority knowledge, everybody took it as the gospel, as the fact. So when you hear people say something like, America's a Christian nation, so our laws should be based on Christian values, it is a popular attitude that because the founding fathers were Christian, clearly they took some of the lessons from the Bible and thoughts about morality, I guess, and freedom and human rights. And they figured, okay, if they use that stuff, therefore the United States is modeled after the Bible. It's a Christian nation, which of course we know is not true. Was it influenced? Sure, but definitely not founded upon. I don't see anybody like, eye for an eye anywhere. But with that said, because we're social creatures, and if we think everyone else agrees with something, we're less likely to question it. But human rights, these aren't up for a popularity vote. That's why we have a constitution, to protect everyone, not just the majority. If civil rights were left to public opinion, segregation might have lasted even longer. And I'm sure women would still be fighting for the right to vote, own property, even be allowed to, pursue a law degree. Fundamental freedoms, whether it's the right to marry, bodily autonomy, free speech, aren't privileges granted by the whims of the majority. They're protections enshrined to ensure justice, even when the majority gets it wrong. This is why I so often say that it's important that we have a federal government to oversee the state government, because we cannot always trust states to do the ethical and moral thing. Let's look now at the straw man fallacy. I think a lot of us recognize this one. This is a fallacy where one twists an opponent's argument into something extreme and just false, and then they attack that fake version. For example, if we allow LGBTQ plus protections, it'll lead to pedophilia and grooming. We hear this all the damn time. And because it creates a fake enemy for people to fight against, it's easier to attack a made up version of the opponent than to deal with their real arguments. And that, of course, as we know, though, is complete bullshit. That's not how things work. You also have the false dilemma fallacy, black and white thinking, as it's more popularly known. This fallacy, it forces you into like a false choice between two extremes. For example, either we allow Christianity in schools or we'll have total moral collapse. We hear this all the time. There's not enough God in schools, right? And because people hate uncertainty, they want clear choices. So politicians frequently will present only two extreme options, and people will pick the one that appeals to them as being the safer of the two. But reality is, it's way more complex than an either or choice. That's why I call this podcast The Ministry of Gray. There's this deep, vast gray area in every decision we have to make. From the death penalty to when the cutoff for abortion should be, the exception for abortions, all of that stuff. Next, we have the appeal to consequences. This is a interesting one because it argues that a law's potential consequences determines its truth. I think the assisted suicide argument is an interesting one because I feel that you see a lot of appeal to consequences within this particular area of law, death with dignity. A lot of times we'll hear the argument from politicians who oppose it that if we allow assisted suicide, what's stopping doctors, caregivers, or impatient family members, I guess, waiting on, inheritance from euthanizing people against their will? People instinctively, they want to avoid worst case scenarios, even if those scenarios aren't real or are highly unlikely to occur. They want absolute perfection in their decisions without regret. And by saying, hey, if you do this, this is what's going to happen as a result, it determines the truth of the benefit of that law or not, regardless if what they're stating is an actual fact. It's almost like slippery slope. It's very similar. But instead, it's focusing on the consequences of the choice more so than anything. Another popular one we see, and we hear this all the time with MAGA, okay, is the no true Scotsman fallacy. This particular fallacious thinking, it excludes people from a group if they don't fit the desired narrative. And we see this all the time where we'll see moderate Christians go, oh, MAGA Christians, they aren't real Christians. They're not following Christ's words and laws and lessons about love and tolerance, etc. We hear this constantly. And that's because it creates an in-group versus out-group mentality. It makes people afraid to challenge their own beliefs at the same time. Because the reality is, at some point before MAGA became this like other from moderate Christianity, moderate Christians and MAGA were sitting in the same pews together under the same church robes at one point. The reality is that moderate Christians tended to turn a blind eye or dismiss the zealotry they were seeing and hypocrisy coming out of the extremist right wing MAGA Christians under their roofs. And now, instead of acknowledging that this was born and bred under their own church guidance and community, it's easy just to treat them as an other like they were never a part of it to begin with. And this is fallacious thinking. This is litmus testing. You can see this too when a senator is called a rhino by Donald Trump because Donald Trump is angry that they aren't agreeing with his narrative or his plans. So now this person is a Republican in name only, you know. But a week ago, that person was just fine and could have been his best man at a wedding, and he loved the guy. This litmus testing is a problem because it glosses over the reality of you're not confronting the actual issue at hand. Instead, it's easier to just divorce the issue away from yourself and treat it as another. And then I want to wrap this up with the red herring fallacy. This is another one that politicians often use. And what they do is they use this to distract from the real issue with an unrelated topic. For example, you might say, forget about clergy abuse, drag queens are corrupting children. I'm trying to distract away from clergy abuse that's not been addressed by instead focusing on the potential for abuse and corruption by drag queens of children, which we know is total bullshit. My example is kind of like a red herring fallacy and a straw man in one. And understand that you could like do 5 or 6 of these fallacies in just a single sentence. It's not that difficult to do. And the reason why this is so effective is because, again, it shifts that outrage onto a scapegoat, keeping people from holding actual abusers or troublemakers accountable for the problems. Those are my top 10 fallacies politicians use. Now, you'll also see, like this past week, we saw J.D. Vance and Trump kind of gang up on Zelensky during a Oval Office interview. And J.D. Vance and Trump also did things like appeal to nationalism, appeal to force. That appeal to force is kind of when Trump had said, no, 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 you've talked enough, and kind of made Zelensky shut up. We call it fear of the stick. I think there was a lot of gish galloping, and that's where someone presents a ton of arguments. Some of them are even not actual arguments. They're just made up facts and red herrings, but they're throwing them out at such a pace that it overwhelms the other person that they don't have a chance to get their bearings and address them at all. And we saw that happen with Zelensky. He was talked over constantly. The takeaway I think you should keep in mind is that no matter how persuasive these politicians sound, if you take a little while to step back, try to put your feels away for a minute and just analyze the arguments that they're making, you can find these fallacies because most of the time they're not making real arguments. They're just dressing up their biases in fancy words. And that hopefully will help you get a better idea of how you are taken advantage of by politicians, whether you're left, right, or independent. Being aware of these fallacies, including in your own reasoning, is important. I should point that out. When you're constantly being exposed to this type of thinking, you tend to also adapt and then adopt these same ways of thinking and use them yourself in your own life. We're all guilty of every single one of these fallacies I've just mentioned, especially when we're in the heat of a moment, upset, or being emotional. It's very easy to just fly into these fallacies in order to confirm your own biases and perceptions to feel better, to get that physiological response that you're comfortable with. And on the note of hypocrisy, in the upcoming segment, we're going to take a look at this week's biggest religious hypocrisy scandals, and trust me, they are, so good. Hey, listeners! Satan's little side piece here. I really hope you're enjoying the show so far, and if you're loving what you hear, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay updated with all of my episodes. Your support really helps me grow and reach more people like yourself. And guess what? There's even more for you over on my website, mogpodcast.com. That's mogpodcast.com. Please check it out. Get the scoop on upcoming episodes, exciting guests, and all the ways you can support this podcast. Thanks for being part of the Mogcast family. Welcome back from our little short break. I hope you got a nice little stretch in and are ready to expose the ever-growing mountain of hypocrisy from religious leaders who preach virtue while practicing vice. This week, I have 3 particularly egregious cases of fraud, abuse, and cover-ups because, when it comes to religious leadership, the scandals never seem to end. So let's get into our first story. It's about a Myrtle Beach pastor using his church as a piggy bank while also allegedly abusing women. And, it's one thing for a church to be rich. It's another for it to be run like a personal slush fund while its pastor allegedly preys on vulnerable women. Meet John Paul Miller, pastor of Solid Rock Church in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. In the middle of 2024, this man controlled a $6 million real estate empire, including a private plane and a massive swath of land. And according to a 43-page lawsuit, he also used his ministry not for God, but for personal wealth, power, and exploitation. But it doesn't stop at money. The lawsuit also accuses Miller of grooming and abusing women, using his religious authority to manipulate victims while maintaining the trust of his followers. And just to pile on to this tragedy, Miller's wife, Micah, died by suicide in April of last year amid allegations of domestic abuse and a bitter divorce. And I guess here's for me the biggest problem. This isn't just a story about one bad pastor. It's about a system that allows men like Miller to thrive. He built his empire on tax-free donations because hello, I'm a church. And then he encouraged tithing while hoarding this wealth while using it as a hunting ground for victims. And now the lawsuits are rolling in. But seriously, I don't know how many times we've heard this exact story before, right? Another story I caught wind of this week was a church minister who knew about decades of abuse and, like always, did absolutely fucking nothing. This happened over in England, where a church minister is now facing disciplinary action for ignoring decades of sexual abuse. I'm talking about Reverend Sue Coleman. She's the associate minister at St. Leonard's Church in Oakley, and according to a very damning abuse report, she knew about the crimes of Christian camp leader John Smythe, one of the most prolific abusers in UK church history, by the way, and she did nothing. Kind of like, Jim Jordan up in Ohio with all of those wrestlers that were molested. And he says, I didn't know shit, when clearly he did. But yeah, and she, of course, isn't a known. She's facing possible discipline along with other clergy members, including the former Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey. Yes, guys, that is the head of the Church of England himself. And I think this is what we always see in church abuse scandals. There's like 4 steps. 1, abuse. 2, ignore or cover up said abuse. 3, the survivors finally are able to speak out, even if it's decades later. And then 4, act shocked and promise to reform, right? And here we are again. Reverend Sue Coleman and her colleagues, though, they didn't just fail 1 or 2 victims. They failed an entire generation of children who were abused under their watch. And now that they're being investigated, the church is saying that they will review the situation. How fucking comforting, right? And then my last story for this week that I came across was a South Carolina church that tried to use religious exemption as a defense for sex abuse in a lawsuit that they're named in. I'm not kidding. This is like really particularly disgusting to me as an example of religious institutions regularly trying to dodge responsibility. In Fort Mill, South Carolina, a megachurch called Morning Star Fellowship was sued after a former youth leader, big surprise, was convicted of sexually assaulting multiple boys. And the response from the church, they said that religious freedom should be their legal shield to avoid being held accountable. You are not mishearing me here. They literally said the First Amendment protects them from being sued over child sex abuse. Thankfully, a South Carolina judge wasn't having it. Judge Martha Rivers, she ruled that sex assaults are not ecclesiastical doctrine, and therefore the church cannot claim religious immunity. But I can't still stop but think about how insane this entire scenario is. A church is actually arguing in court that their religious status means they shouldn't be held responsible for enabling abuse. And this is not an isolated incident, by the way. Religious institutions are constantly trying to use their sacred status to avoid the law, whether it's covering up clergy abuse, avoiding financial transparency, and even denying, LGBTQ plus protections. Thankfully, though, this time they lost. And honestly, it's about time the courts started calling bullshit on churches that hide behind God to avoid accountability, in my opinion. So, looking at this past week, we had, a megachurch pastor using congregational money to fund personal wealth and abuse women. We had a very, very high ranking official within the Church of England ignoring decades of sex abuse, and a South Carolina megachurch trying to avoid accountability for sex abuse under the First Amendment. And at the end of the day, I asked myself, just how surprised am I by these stories? And I'm not. These cases, these are just like three examples from this 1 week alone. And they prove again that religion is too often a tool for power, manipulation, and abuse. And on that note, I want to kind of explore Pope Francis' so called legacy. I know he's been pretty much on his deathbed the past couple of weeks. And I think it's important to understand that he's not the reformer people think he is. Stay tuned. That's coming up next. As promised, we're going to explore the legacy of Pope Francis on this episode, specifically his role in addressing, or I think failing to address, the Catholic Church's decades long sex abuse scandal. As you know, for years, Pope Francis has been praised as a reformer, a progressive. I remember when he took over for John Paul, he was the Pope that always preached about shoe leather, getting out there on the streets, getting to know the people, being a part of the community, not just sitting behind a desk. Very much, the cool Pope. The guy who's finally going to clean up the mess the church has swept under the rug for centuries. That was the general vibe and messaging we were receiving when he came, into power. But I want to take a closer look. I don't think he really is this reformer people claim he is. Better yet, I think that really he's just another damage control specialist. And I think to get an idea of what's going on, though, why his legacy is so important now, you have to consider the latest Vatican report from their own Child Protection Commission. This isn't some report from an outside critic or a victims advocacy group. This is coming straight from the Vatican's own Child Protection Commission. This was set up back in 2014 under Pope Francis, and it was supposed to bring transparency and accountability to the church's handling of sexual abuse cases. And a decade later, they finally put out their first ever official report, which is kind of ridiculous. And it says that, and I quote, "The church is still failing to ensure that clerical sexual abuse cases are dealt with adequately." And honestly, guys, it gets worse than this. Church leaders who ignore abuse or cover it up are described in this report as a further source of evil for victims. But instead of actually holding them accountable, the Vatican still doesn't have a clear, effective process for removing them. Think about that. Just for decades now, the church's response to sex abuse has been to cover it up, relocate abusive priests, and silence victims. And after a decade of Pope Francis's leadership, what's changed? The Vatican's own commission admits that the church is still dragging its feet, that victims still don't have access to information about their cases, that bishops who ignore abuse allegations still aren't being removed. This isn't reform, guys, it's window dressing. And I can back this up further because there was another report out that says, and I'll give a quote here, "It doesn't focus on the central and devastating realities that children in the Catholic Church are still being sexually assaulted by clergy, and that universal church law still allows these priests to be reinstated if certain conditions are met." That's the problem to me right there. Priests who are caught abusing children can still fucking get their jobs back. And I'm just like, how? Why? Okay. And it turns out that's because the universal church law allows abusers to be reinstated. It's the church rules. If the church decides a predator has repented enough, they could put him right back into a parish, and often without even telling the public he was removed in the first place. And let's talk about reporting abuse, because according to this report, that process is still completely broken. Victims who report abuse still face secrecy and stonewalling. They don't get clear answers about their cases, and they still have to deal with church leaders protecting the institutions first. So the next time Pope Francis, if he manages to be able to stand up, and gives a tearful speech about how heartbroken he is over abuse scandals, I think we need to be asking, why is his own Vatican Commission saying nothing has changed? Like, why? And that's the thing. I think it comes down to Pope Francis is a damage control specialist more than a problem solver. I was reading an article titled Francis' 2019 Historic Abuse Summit was a PR move, not real reform. And it was interesting because some still like to argue that he's tried to reform the church, that he's honestly tried. And they'll often point to this historic abuse summit from back in 2019 or his decree he released that same year, the Vos Estis Lux Mundi, which set up new procedures for handling abuse cases. But I think that's the problem. Those policies, they don't actually work. Let me break it down a little bit. The 2019 summit itself, it was just a lot of speeches and there wasn't a lot of action. This decree that he put out, it has no enforcement to it at all, zero teeth. And on top of that, this whole zero tolerance promise, there's still no clear process for removing abusive bishops. That tells me that his role is really just more about public PR damage control. He's not a reformer. He's the Catholic Church's PR guy. He says the right things, he makes big symbolic gestures, but ultimately protects the same institution that has enabled decades of abuse. And don't get me wrong, it's not the commission or the victims or family members of the victims that are kind of trying to call him to the carpet, even while he's on his deathbed at this point. There are global leaders out there calling him out to his face. During a recent visit to Belgium in 2024, Pope Francis got a public rebuke from King Philippe and Prime Minister Alexander De Croo over the church's handling of abuse. And the reason they did this was because the Belgian government itself had just finished investigating decades of abuse cases as well, and they found that, again, the Catholic Church was still covering up the crimes. They called Francis out directly, demanding real action, and what do you think his response was? I quote, "The Church will continue its efforts to protect the victims and seek justice." Like, that's it. That's all he did. Just more words. And I think that's where we need to answer this larger question. Is Pope Francis really a reformer when it comes to the church's abuse crisis? I have to say clearly not. And again, we've got 5 key points here. The Vatican's own Child Protection Commission says abuse is still mishandled. Priests who abuse kids can still be reinstated under universal church law. The church's reporting process, it's still full of secrecy, conflicts of interest, and has zero enforcement teeth. France's so-called reforms, they're mostly symbolic. And even world leaders are calling him out at this point, and all he's got is just more talk. I think it's time to be honest. Pope Francis is no different than past popes when it comes to handling abuse claims. He protects the church first, victims second, if at all. And history is going to remember him as just another pope who talked big but did nothing to dismantle a system that has continuously enabled predators. Quick reminder, folks, if you're finding value in today's episode, take a moment to hit that like button, share it with a friend, subscribe wherever you're tuning in. Also, please don't miss out on all the extras I have waiting for you on my website, mogpodcast.com. That's mogpodcast.com. From behind-the-scenes content to ways you can support or work with us, it's all there. Plus, you'll get a sneak peek at future episodes and special guests. Thanks for being here. I could not do this without you. Welcome back, and we're going to begin a recurring segment that will be going forward on future episodes on deconstructing faith. And I wanted to start this particular series off by introducing my own experiences and history, I guess, because you may find that you can relate to a lot of it. You may find that I've discovered facts and truths that you're still on the journey toward. And I think the very first truth that one has to accept is that breaking free from faith, it isn't just an intellectual process. It's a physical and psychological one. When you've spent your whole life believing, obeying, fearing, your brain and body don't just let go overnight. It's like detoxing from something that shaped your biology. You don't simply stop believing with the flick of a switch. There's the anxiety of questioning, the guilt that lingers even when you know better, the phantom fears of hellfire, divine punishment, and existential dread. Leaving faith feels like withdrawal, and for many of us, that's exactly what it is. But for myself and many others, it's not just about intellectual doubt or theological questions. It goes deeper. It's about seeking answers when you're met with silence, when you're conditioned to believe that divine validation is the only thing that can affirm your worth, but all you get is emptiness. I had a childhood friend who went through this in a way I'll never personally forget. Her journey out of faith was very disturbing. I would say it was a desperate one. And it wasn't just about religious trauma. This was what happens when faith fails a child, when you're told to look for divine validation and instead you're left with silence. Silence that breeds desperation. She was born into a Pentecostal family, much like myself. In fact, we attended the same church for a number of years. And her life was so entwined with faith that I don't think she could really tell where her belief ended and she began. Her earliest memories were filled with hymns in the church, hands raised in rapture, voices speaking in tongues as though the whole world were some kind of like a divine symphony. This is the experience that she and I had together. And this isn't just something she believed. It was something she lived, something that we both like breathed. Faith wasn't a part of her. It was the very air she inhaled. At 5 years old, our pastor had asked us if we wanted to let Jesus into our heart. And even though she didn't understand the meaning of salvation, she said yes because she saw her mom's tear-streaked face, standing over top of her by the pew, just glowing with pride and happiness. And she felt this warmth of approval also from all of the congregants surrounding us. So naturally, she said yes. A week later, she was baptized, dipped into the water, raised up a new creation, washed clean in God's eyes. And it was her first taste of belonging, the first time she truly felt she mattered. But in our church, belonging wasn't enough. To be truly accepted, you also had to have a talent. You had to be set apart, special, right? And at 6 years old, we all had to go in the middle of Sunday school class, sit in a quiet room, and learn how to hear God's voice to receive the gift of tongues. She was told that if she prayed hard enough, opened her heart wide enough, God would fill her with the Holy Spirit. So she shut her eyes so tight she could probably see stars. I know I was seeing stars, how tightly I had my eyes closed that day. And she waited. And nothing came to her. And the adults in the room urged us on. Just try. Say what God is telling you. Listen for his closeness. And she tried. And she even tried to mimic the sounds that she had heard so many times before from her mom and the other adults up in the main assembly prayer. And I remember her saying, boom shakalaka and shaka khan, right? It wasn't perfect, but maybe it was enough. She waited and waited. And then suddenly, in the middle of the prayer circle, one of the other kids began sobbing uncontrollably. This girl's words were pouring out of her like an overflowing river. Her body was shaking, and everyone was believing that she had received divine revelation. You heard everyone saying, Hallelujah, and she's been touched by the Holy Spirit. All these adults rushed to her, lifted her up, praised her. She had been chosen. And my friend, she was just a little girl, muttering symbols into a void, hoping, praying that maybe, just maybe, God would actually listen to her. In this moment, she felt a lot of disappointment, I think, because her father was a bit of a biblical scholar, an amateur one, though. But he was a man who preached about the revelations and rapture, and he believed that the world was going to end in 1988. In fact, he clung to scripture like it was his personal prophecy. He was a very much a dedicated man of faith, and at least in the congregation in our church. But I came to find out later that at home, he was somebody completely different. My friend, she remembered the yelling, the slamming of doors, the sound of things being thrown, crashing against the walls. She was terrified of him, and he hated who she was. And her mom? Oh, she was the model Pentecostal wife. Submitted, obeyed, prayed. One of those God will heal our family types, right? But the beatings didn't stop. The verbal abuse didn't stop. And when my friend turned 9, this man who was supposed to protect her, the man who prayed the loudest of anyone in the church, he became her first abuser. It happened when her mom was sick and in the hospital. I think he panicked. I think that's what she had told me. But one morning, he invited her to his bed and he pretended that she was mom. And the next morning, he sat on her bed. His voice was low. He was very contrite. And he, had said to her, "I'm sorry. I did something no father should do to his daughter. But don't tell your mother. She's too sick to handle it right now. We'll talk to her about it later." And so my friend never said anything to anyone about what happened. I didn't even find out till years later. She had learned early on from her dad's behavior that she was a burden. His love came in fits and starts. Sometimes he was warm, other times distant, withdrawn. Her mom was always tired, depressed. I mean, she was so checked out that she wasn't a source of comfort at all. And this girl, she tried in every way she could to be seen. So she would act out. She misbehaved because in her young mind, even bad attention was better than nothing. And one of her earliest memories she told me about was destroying a favorite brooch of her mother's. She thought that if she broke it, it would spark something, some real reaction, something that proved she mattered, that would get their attention that she was struggling. But it didn't work. By the time she turned 12, her world, I think, was probably a blur of pain and confusion. She had learned exactly what her father had done to her body at that point, what men were capable of, and she turned that knowledge into a test. Since she couldn't get God's attention, she told me, if demons are real, they'll attack me, they'll touch me, they'll prove itself in a way I understand best. And so she started seeing something strange in the mirror one day, a hardness in her own reflection. And at one point, she told me that even though it was her, clearly it was a stranger staring back at her. She convinced herself that this was actually a demon in her mirror. And if demons were real, then God had to be real too. So she had started to call it out, daring it to hurt her. That way she could get proof. But nothing came of this exercise, just silence and glaring. And then finally, I think when she was about 16, she snapped. She had confronted her parents, demanding respect, freedom, anything at this point, right? She threatened to end her life if they wouldn't let her go live with a friend. They sent her to 2 therapy sessions before deciding that it was too expensive, and they just let her walk out. They let her go move in with her best friends, and she left that night. And just like that, the demons vanished. No more faces in the walls. No more whispers in the dark. No more mirror that wasn't really a mirror. And I think that's when she realized it had never been God or the devil. It had been her own mind desperately trying to survive in a place that refused to acknowledge her pain. And this is just one of many ways that religious trauma can impact children. When belief is everything, when your worth, your survival, your eternal fate depends on being in God's good graces, what do you do when He doesn't answer? You chase Him. You break yourself trying to force Him to show up. You bend, you beg, you bleed, because anything is better than this silence, this lack of acknowledgement. And that girl, the one who prayed for demons to assault her just to confirm that God was real, that was me. And looking back, I don't recognize her. I don't know who she was, but I do know this. When I finally let go of God later on in my 20s, I finally let go of the need to be hurt to prove that I was worthy and cared about. And that is a gift to myself, because there is no cosmic judge keeping score. There is no grand test I've got to pass. There is no invisible Father watching, waiting to punish or reward you. There's just you. And you don't have to suffer to be real. Suffering serves no purpose but to keep you conditioned to keep taking the abuse, to be codependent upon stress, addicted to fear, complacent with self-imposed martyrdom for the sake of what? Proving your humanity and worth to others? You don't have to participate in divine suffering to be a worthwhile, moral human being. You already are. Well, we've made it to the end of another episode together. And what do you think you can take away from all of this today in this episode? I think that if there's one thread that connects everything we've covered today, from the politicians twisting faith for control, the religious leaders exposed for hypocrisy, the institutions protecting abusers, and the personal struggle of breaking free from harmful belief systems, it's this: faith, when wielded by power, isn't about morality. It's about control. It's about keeping people obedient, unquestioning, afraid. It's about making sure the systems built to benefit the few stay intact, even when they harm the many. And when you start to see the system for what it is, when you recognize that the laws being passed aren't about protecting faith, but enforcing a specific ideology, that religious leaders aren't falling from grace, but were never worthy of worship to begin with, that doctrines about parenting and punishment aren't about raising good children, but producing obedient followers, what do you do with that knowledge? Because that's the real question. Do you just move on, accepting that this is how things have always been? Do you let the discomfort pass, convincing yourself that maybe it's not your fight? Or do you start questioning everything that was handed to you as truth and decide to never be controlled again? This isn't just about faith, it's about power. It's about learning to recognize the difference between belief and manipulation, morality and obedience, guidance and control. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Until next time, keep sharp, always question those sacred cows, and find your happiness on your terms. Thank you for joining me on the Ministry of Gray, where life's complexity is not a problem to solve, but a space to grow. And if this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who you think might need it. And visit mogpodcast.com to stay connected for all the upcoming features and interviews. Remember, the gray spaces are where we find our humanity. Until next time.